Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 330 part 2, which therefore technically makes it the absolute last video of 2024, so let's get straight in with questions. Reva's Rambling Recess asks, having seen the conditionally famous toaster on the galley of HMS Cavalier, could you give us a brief overview of the developments of galley equipment from the first electrified galleys through to the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War? Well, very brief because my knowledge of this area is not quite as advanced as others, but from what I've read, once you started to get electrified galleys coming in, equipment switched over to electrification pretty much as fast as they could, obviously depending on the power load that the ship could supply. Because prior to electrification, your three main ways of supplying heat to a galley would be really old school coal or oil, and obviously as a ship pitches and rolls violently in weather or potentially takes battle damage, especially in the case of oil-fired galleys, I don't think I need to elaborate on how bad that could be if you get burning coal or burning oil just sloshing around, and that's without the galley fires that would occasionally break out from things like deep fryers and so forth. The other way of doing it was steam heating, but obviously there is only a certain amount of that you can do, because that obviously involves drawing steam up from the boilers, which slightly reduces the ship's power output. That's in and of itself not too much of a problem. The larger problem is that steam power is good for things like, say, if you've got an oven, you could run steam pipes around that, or let's say something like a really big soup pot. You could run steam around that in kind of a jacket, which would obviously heat things up, but it is less controllable in fine detail than it is if you have an electric device. So if you want to do a bit more precision cooking rather than just this hot, this cook thing, then electrical equipment is better. And of course, once again, in the case of battle damage, obviously during battle you try and have your galley shut down, but if you did have battle damage or storm damage or whatever, a cracked steam pipe full of hot steam supplying heat to your galley is considerably worse than if the same damage just severs an electrical cable. I mean, unless you get a short across something, but that's relatively rare compared to, oh look, the entire galley is now full of scalding steam. The other thing that electricity, of course, allowed is that procedures that were normally done by hand, you can see in this case, I think they're peeling potatoes back there, could to a certain degree be automated. Now, how much automation took place would depend on the size and type of the ship, because obviously a small destroyer might still be relying on canned goods once they're a couple of days out of port, because there isn't really the space or the power generation capacity for a large refrigerator room, at least in early destroyers. Obviously, as destroyers get larger and more advanced through to World War II, then they start to get refrigeration rooms. Whereas on battleships, relatively early on, you'd see cool rooms or refrigerators, and that would then expand as the ships expanded and also as time moved on. But say you wanted to make cake for the crew. Now, obviously, you could make cake batter in a nice big vat, but you'd need to get a stirring paddle about the size of an oar and possibly 2 or 3 people to actually stir the thing. Or, as I said, as electricity advances and there's more available, you could get a big electrically powered stirring vat, and that would not just reduce the number of people you needed in the galley, reducing crowding, but also by automating the process, you could set everything running. You could have multiple vats running at the same time under the control of a relatively small number of people. And one of the big things that's probably not really appreciated so much is that a lot of this stuff would have to be gimbal mounted, because if the ship starts to pitch or roll particularly violently, if everything is just flat mounted, then, well, unless you want stuff being spilt everywhere, you'd have to stop. Whereas if you have stuff gimbal mounted, to a certain degree, you can keep going even while the ship is in significant motion. Now, of course, in really bad weather, you would still have to shut down the galley completely. But essentially, if you're looking at galley space from the perspective of the first electrified galleys through to the end of the time period the channel covers, it's mostly just increasing amounts of electrification and automation, primarily dependent on how much space the galley has, which is a function of how large the ship itself has, and how much electrical power you can actually draw, and what type of electrical power you can draw as well, because let's face it, in some of the earlier ships, which would just have one or two extremely high voltage circuits, it would be unsafe to have much electrical galley equipment, whereas once they start having slightly saner voltages and amperages on various circuits, then you can use a lot more equipment without the risk of the galley becoming a human-scale fly zapper. HMS Implosive asks, from listening to you and Dr. Clark, I've understood that the main way that all forward arrangements save weight is by virtue of needing the space-consuming insulative spaces in between the machinery and the magazines only at one end of the ship instead of both ends in a more conventional layout. Dr. Clark even argued that in an all-forward layout, it is beneficial to have turbine rooms in front of the boiler rooms due to them being cooler than the boiler rooms. As such, I was surprised to notice that by looking at deck plans of US fast battleships, that the magazines generally seem to be separated from machinery spaces only by transverse bulkheads, not by any large rooms in between. Even more surprised I was to find out that secondary battery magazines were right on top of the machinery spaces in between the funnel uptakes, as I would imagine these rooms would have been rather difficult to keep cool. What am I missing? There usually are rooms separating the machinery and magazines on US fast battleships, so I pulled the plans for the South Dakota class because they're the most compact and the most tightly fitted of the US fast battleships. So if there was ever going to be machinery right adjacent to the magazines, it would be on them. But as you can see here, this is turret 3, the aft turret. There's the machinery room, number 4, there on the right-hand side, and then you've got the powder handling rooms, aka the magazines, etc., there on the left. And you can see in between, you've got an emergency diesel generator room, then the aft distribution room, and a 20mm magazine. Now, obviously that's not ideal, but it is some compartmentalization from the main 16-inch magazines. And that 20mm mag, yes, it is a potential vulnerability, but of course 20mm ammunition is fully cased and inside its own drums, usually. So it's somewhat less of a hazard compared to having, silk bag charges, each weighing 90 pounds or so, stacked up there instead. And if we make our way to the forward section, so this is turret 2, the super firing turret, and you can see there's machinery room number 1 now on the left, and in between you have the evaporating and distilling room, which is taking up the vast majority of it, but also forward plotting and radio control, and that's separating out the forward 16-inch powder handling rooms there from the machinery spaces. So there is this kind of distribution for US fast battleships, even in, as I say, the relatively compact South Dakota class. But interestingly enough, on the Iowas, it's not quite the same case. So this is the Iowa deck plan. You may recognize this from the logistics video, and you can see here that the aft powder rooms are in fact directly adjacent to the aftmost of the machinery sections, albeit, fair enough, they are right adjacent to the aft turbines. So the aft turbines are separating them out from the boiler rooms. But perhaps more interestingly, up forward, you can see this kind of slight dogleg pattern happening around turret 2, and that's because on the starboard side you have quite a large gap between the 16-inch powder magazine and the forward boiler rooms, made up of the main battery plotting section and combat information center. But on the port side, although there is a secondary battery plotting section, there is a 16-inch powder magazine and 40mm magazine that does actually abut directly to the boiler room. that's not necessarily a good thing. Although I can imagine a partial caveat being made in as much as there's plenty of other 16-inch powder magazines for both Turret 1 and Turret 2 somewhat forward. So I would imagine that although they accepted this compromise to store enough powder, perhaps they would look at consuming the powder that's in the more forward powder magazines first, and then, because you're very unlikely to run through all your powder in a single engagement, then run the powder from this portside storage area forward, which would allow it to cool down before it was next needed. But you are absolutely correct when you look at the secondary battery magazines in general, because obviously here's another of those maps, and you can see the 6 big red areas amidships. Those are the 5-inch powder magazines as well as the lower handling areas, and they are well down in the ship, as you mentioned, directly in between the upper reaches of some of the machinery spaces. Unfortunately, this is something of a compromise that the US fast battleships had to take on, because on the one hand, on the positive side, it meant that the 5-inch powder magazines were below the armour deck, which obviously meant that gunfire wouldn't be able to easily penetrate them and set them off, and of course, being stuck amongst the machinery, they're also behind the main armour belt. The flip side, as you said, of course, is that they are going to be somewhat warmer than would be necessarily ideal unless you have massive amounts of cooling going on. But then again, on the flip side, they are cased charges, so they have a bit more heat sink capacity than the bagged charges of the main battery, although of course the main battery charges are stored in their own containers as well. But the main reason for this particular compromise, because let's face it, pretty much most ships would have their secondary battery magazines underneath armour anyway, is that this facilitates the high rate of fire of the 5-inch 38s, because you can have the hoists going straight from the magazines almost vertically up, not quite vertically, but almost straight up to each individual mount or turret, and then there's an upper handling room which is above the main deck for each of the turrets, but then that can be fed straight to each individual gun, and thus this ensures a steady supply of ammunition essentially directly from the magazines, which enables them to maintain a good rate of fire. Whereas on some other ships, other more conventionally laid out ships, like the US class battleships are conventionally laid out, the secondary battery amidships might not have this facility because they, other navies took consideration of, well, we don't like having our secondary magazines right in amongst our machinery for the reasons you outlined. And then you would have secondary magazines fore and aft near the main magazines. That obviously has an advantage of removing a potentially explosive situation from the middle of the machinery and also allowing more stable temperature control. The flip side to that is, of course, that when the shells are hoisted up, you need some way of conveying them along the length of the ship at the level of the secondary battery to get to the secondary battery, which introduces another step, and a relatively vulnerable step, which could be disrupted, which might impede your ability to maintain a high rate of fire. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. Smelly Kaka asks, I've seen commentary about ships that achieved their design speed in trials, but seldom or ever did in service. Various reasons are cited, including changes in displacement, machinery condition, and hull growth. To what extent can this also be explained by changing tactical situations where circumstances calling for maximum speed ended before the ship had time to reach it? There is a certain amount of validity to that when it comes to combat speeds. Obviously, as you mentioned, whether a ship is deep loaded or not, how long it's been out of port without machinery overhaul, how much hull growth it has in terms of, seaweed and so forth, all of that can also affect the top speed. But when you call for maximum speed in combat situations, it still takes quite some time to work up to full speed. Now, and that's assuming that all these other situations don't factor in, because obviously a lot of the time they will. If you are, let's say, 3 months out of port and in the tropics, which is really bad for hull growth, but you're still very heavily loaded with food and ammunition and fuel perhaps you've just taken on from a replenishment ship, then it really doesn't matter how long the combat goes on for and how much power you put into the ship, you are probably not reaching your design speed. But there is also a certain validity to, well, it takes a lot of time to get those last few knots out. So if you look at a graph of power requirement versus speed, you'll see it's almost an exponential graph, not quite, but almost, and a chart of speed versus time in terms of how long it takes you to accelerate to a certain speed. It's almost the inverse of that. You can get from 0 knots to, let's say, half or 2/3 of your speed pretty quickly, but getting from, say, 2/3 to your design speed, it will take almost as long, if not longer, than it took you to get to 2/3 of your speed. And that's because of the ever-increasing power output and the fact you can't just dial up extra power immediately. You have to build up steam pressure, etc., at least in a ship that depends on steam turbines for propulsion. And in combat, you may not be running in a way that is conducive to your trial's design speed. So you might be running against the wind, into the waves. That's going to slow you down somewhat. You might have to be taking evasive action or just course changes to follow an enemy. Every time you turn, you'll be losing a bit of speed. And just to emphasize how much additional power you need to reach your top speed, bear in mind that in some of the more radical redesigns of the Iowa class, or at least the Kentucky and possibly the Illinois in the early Cold War, in the designs where they were looking at putting a massive nuclear missile system in place of half the power plant, the speed of the Iowas, with half their power removed, was still anticipated to be around 27 or 28 knots. So for a 45,000 ton plus battleship, which was obviously designed to hit 33 knots, cutting its power plant and thus the amount of power available to the propellers by 50% only dropped its speed by 5 knots. So about 15% of the top speed, and actually, ironically enough, left the ships about as fast as the North Carolinas and South Dakotas with their full machinery power output. So it gives you some idea of just how much of a ship's power plant is devoted to those last few knots of speed. And commensurately, therefore, the fact you have to have all the boilers operational at full blast to get there. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, "It's rumoured that Beatty's wife was an heiress, unfaithful, a divorcee infected with social diseases, a bon vivant, and worst of all, an American. As an American, perhaps I don't understand the upper echelons of British society, but the common perception is that such a marriage would stunt any gentleman's career. Yet, adding to the enigma that is Beatty, rather than stunting his career, he and his wife would repeatedly host Edward VII. How is it that even Nelson was not above reproach for alleged marital misgivings, while Beatty seems impervious to the miasma of a marriage that only a tabloid writer could love?" Well, there's a variety of circumstances. I mean, partly it's the fact that Nelson was around in the late 18th and very early 19th centuries. Beatty was around at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, and standards had changed slightly. Not hugely, but somewhat. But there's other factors that go into that. There's also the fact that, well, yes, Edward VII was, shall we say, somewhat liberal when it came to the moral standards of the times, to put it mildly. So, given the amount of private and occasionally public reproach he was getting for the, at the time, rumours, although mostly well-founded, of what he was getting up to, the relatively minor indiscretion of, at least on a social level, of hosting Beatty and his wife was basically negligible. And it also helped that Beatty had something of a reputation already before he got involved with the lady who would eventually become his wife. Another factor is that by the time of Beatty, as opposed to the time of Nelson, although this situation could still be a factor in stunting his career somewhat, the fact is that although the nobility and the officer corps and the admiralty were still somewhat intertwined, they were considerably more separated than they had been in Nelson's time. So in Nelson's time, if you did something that offended the, at least public supposed, morals of the aristocracy, they pretty much had control over all of the upper echelons of British society. So if, for example, you were an admiral or a captain, you could find your career very heavily stunted because the very people you offended were very often also your superiors, either in the direct military chain of command or in the civilian side of the Admiralty. Whereas by Beatty's time, while those, as I said, those connections were still there, they were somewhat weakened, and you might get a fair bit of social pushback from people who were supposed to be your peers. But within the Navy itself, you would probably most likely have to deal more so with the personal disapproval of some of your senior officers rather than the full bore of societal pressure which would have existed during the Age of Sail. And Beatty didn't escape entirely without censure, although his naval career, in terms of his main line of promotion, didn't suffer quite so much from his marriage. His other appointments, or potential appointments, outside of line command and his social standing did take quite a few hits, and some opportunities were denied him partly on the basis of his choice of wife. Although, to take a slight brief detour for a very brief explanation for those American viewers, it isn't so much that absolutely any American trying to marry into the British upper classes, either back then or now, is seen as a bad thing, as there are quite a number of examples of both American men and women marrying fairly successfully into the British upper classes. But there is something of a cultural clash, understandably, and some Americans who marry into the British upper classes, either deliberately or unknowingly, don't seem to get and refuse to learn what the differences are, and therefore can't or won't adapt to their new situations. And you can argue the merits of whether they should or not, back and forth till the cows come home, but ultimately, if they move over into the upper echelons of British society, they are going to be significantly outnumbered, so there are going to be expectations of how they're going to behave. And from what I've both seen and had related to me, I think probably the single most fundamental issue in probably the biggest headline cases in terms of Beatty, or the brief and not particularly lamented Edward VIII, and a few other more recent examples, which you can probably imagine, seems to be along the lines of perhaps either deliberately or not understanding that certain roles in British society, particularly when you get to the highest levels like the royal family, are more about what you are than a role that you take on. So, for example, in the US, you may become the president, and while you are the president, you are the president, but then you stop becoming the president when your term expires or you lose an election. And while you may then have be a former president, it is a transitory thing. Whereas if you are a prince or the king or the queen, that is what you are. And that's never going to stop as long as you're alive, unless, of course, you get an upgrade from prince to king or princess to queen. But then you are that. And if that role is fundamentally a part of who you are, it's not something that can be switched off. It's not like modern celebrity or political position where you might have a public-facing side and then in private you drop all of that and you are just whoever, regular person. Obviously, upper echelons, dukes, earls, royal family, etc., they can have a non-public facing side of things, which they can choose to allow you to see or choose to allow you to relate to, but that is an active choice, and even then they still, to a certain extent, are what their public role is, which is going to affect how you are supposed to treat them. And if you don't get that, it can cause some major problems. Perhaps the best way to think of it is if you were in the Navy, the captain is always the captain, even if you happen to somehow run into each other in the same bar while you're on leave. So the captain's off duty, you're off duty, you're not on your ship. The captain may then allow you to be a little bit more familiar than you would be in the strict hierarchy of a warship, but he is still, or these days she, is still the captain, and there are limits to how familiar you can be even if you are off duty, and limits to what you can say. And if you go beyond that, you will be in trouble. Similarly in upper echelon social circles. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, in the anime series High School Fleet, the Harakaze, from which I take my name, is almost always able to track incoming shells on her radar from bigger ships such as Musashi, Nagato, Garafsh Bay, and so on, and is equipped with the only standard Imperial Japanese World War II era radar equipment, barring one or two other modern things. On one exceptional occasion, Harakaze's gunnery officer is able to train the main battery and intercept incoming heavy shells using their own large guns. I know this is supposed to be possible using modern CIWS systems, but I was wondering if ships during battles could actually see incoming fire on radar screens, and perhaps try and shoot it out of the sky if radar-assisted fire control was an option. Depending on the radar type in particular, some World War II radar could indeed spot and track incoming or outgoing shells, although depending on the type of radar, whether it was tracking the shell itself or whether it was actually tracking the rather violent disturbance of air that the shell caused in its passage, it depends, as I said. But there is a difference between potentially seeing a shell coming or going, and of course circumstances would also change how or if you could detect the shell, so angle of view and so forth, and even weather conditions might affect it. But there is a big difference between seeing that and being able to shoot it out of the sky with a radar assisted fire control. That's not going to happen, simply because, for one thing, the speed of the shell is going to be vastly in excess of the top speed that the fire control computers are capable of computing for in the Second World War. So they're not going to give you an accurate value anyway. Plus, as I said, you may not actually be tracking the physical shell itself. You may be tracking its turbulence, which would obviously be somewhat behind the shell. And if the shell was aimed directly at you, in theory, some of the more rapid anti-aircraft guns would in theory be able to track it because the relative bearing change isn't going to be all that much. But that's just in terms of, well, the shell is there and now it's 2 degrees off there, now it's 2 degrees off there. In terms of actually getting an accurate aim point, no, it's not going to happen. And as I said, the fire control computer systems wouldn't be able to calculate enough of a lead. So yeah, it's just not. In theory, in an extremely remote 1 in a billion chance, if your radar was perhaps of more advanced type and was actually physically tracking the shell and could give a general bearing to that shell, and people could react fast enough, if you were on a late World War II battleship with lots of 20mm and 40mm and whatever your secondary battery was, you could in theory go, right, funnel all anti-aircraft guns that can bear down that approximate bearing and hope for the best, and essentially just create a wall of metal and fragments and hope that the shell hits one of those. But that's not really targeting and shooting it out of the sky. That's just presenting a bunch of metal debris for the shell to potentially hit. And of course, it's an armor-piercing shell, unlike a modern missile or something like that. There is a relatively high chance that it would just smash its way straight through pretty much anything you put in its way. I mean, maybe a 5 or 5.25 inch shell that made a direct head-on collision would disrupt its flight path, but that would be so spectacularly unlikely as to be not impossible, but if that happened, you better start finding who was praying at the time, because you've just found evidence of the divine and divine blessing. I suppose in theory even a 20mm or 40mm shell might tear open part of the windshield, which might destabilize the shell a little bit, but given the range at which that kind of interception would occur, it probably wouldn't make a huge amount of difference. Duke Master asks, It has been repeatedly mentioned that various First Sea Lords in the interwar years knew for a while the Royal Navy wasn't ready for another war, namely against a selection of European nations. Yet looking at the fleet strengths of Germany, Italy and even France, compared to Britain, none of them really scare me that much. The Royal Navy outnumbered them all by a wide margin, and even Germany and Italy combined didn't have the fleet strength to challenge Britain. What am I missing? Broadly speaking, it was a combination of three factors. The first factor is that Britain was mostly, during the interwar period, thinking of a potential war with Japan, which meant that the China fleet, or China station, was a pretty substantial part of the Royal Navy's commitment. So from the on-paper strength of the Royal Navy, a good chunk of that was devoted to what you might later call East of Aden operations, i.e. Indian Ocean, Western Pacific, which would reduce the number of ships available in the immediate term for a war against a combination of European nations. Secondly, was a technological issue. The most modern Royal Navy ships, fine, they will be perfectly happy going one-on-one with anything that the European powers are putting out. However, a good chunk of the Royal Navy was, of course, older ships holding over from the First World War, and one of the minor advantages to being the Kriegsmarine in the 1930s was that, with the fleet essentially reduced to almost a joke by the Treaty of Versailles, it meant that as the Kriegsmarine built itself up, the vast majority of it was modern warships. And similarly with the Italians, although they hadn't had a rather heavy peace treaty imposed upon them, the collapse of the Italian economy in the late 1910s and early 1920s, and obviously the Great Depression as well not helping, meant that a good chunk of their World War I era fleet wasn't there anymore, and while they were rebuilding, most of their ships were also fairly modern. So the proportion of modern ships the Royal Navy would be facing was actually relatively high compared to its own modern fleet, especially considering that a good chunk of that modern fleet was, as mentioned, over in the Far East. Because, yeah, you might think, okay, yeah, a county class will very happily take on an Admiral Hipper all day. Whatever iteration of the condottieri the Italians are on at this point, a town class will happily deal with. But what about a C-class or a D-class cruiser? You know, how confident are you in those taking on a condottieri or even a Königsberg? And how confident are you in a Hawkins taking on a Hipper? The other thing that also worried various First Sea Lords was the lack of an overall plan. Now, I've covered in previous videos how the Royal Navy didn't really do full-scale plans in the same way that the US had big overarching war plans. The Royal Navy tended to take more of an approach of, we will train our captains and our admirals in dealing with lots and lots of individual given situations. So this is how you fight a fleet battle without particular reference to who exactly you might be fighting or why. This is how you escort a convoy. This is how you conduct a troop landing. This is how you do a raid on an enemy harbour, etc., etc. And then it was assumed that in the time of war, the flag officers would go, okay, well, clearly we need to do this in this situation, and we've done this in practice, so we will adapt that practice to this particular circumstance and run with it that way, which does have its advantages. It does make your fleet somewhat more flexible, especially if you have a sudden change in what you're expecting, because, well, if there's no overall plan to disrupt, the enemy can't disrupt your overall plan. But there were always some larger overarching strategic objectives. The problem in the interwar period was that the Royal Navy's plans on the grander scale, even if loose as they might be, had pretty much been shot through by World War I, pointing out that naval warfare no longer worked that way. You know, right up until maybe less than a decade before World War I, the Royal Navy had gone to its 200-300-year-old proven strategy of close blockade and economic strangulation. The sudden rise in submarines and coastal torpedo craft that could actually stay out at sea and for any significant length of time had put paid to that, and they'd had to suddenly rapidly scramble to go minefields and distant blockade, and then come up with ways of dealing with submarines in the First World War. But that meant that all you had was kind of this slightly half-baked scramble strategy that you'd come up with in the First World War, and that really only applied to dealing with Germany. It wasn't necessarily going to work if you had to deal with Italy or if you had to deal with both of them at the same time. And that is what people like Admiral Cunningham mention in the very late part of the 1930s, when it's becoming increasingly clear that there might be a war with Germany and or Italy, and they're going through this overall plan of where are we going to put the ships, what approximate strategy are we going to use, and there just isn't anything. And they're scrambling to come up with something, because, you know, something that's if you like, a relatively speaking tactical situation like the Abyssinia crisis. Italy is sending ships through the Suez Canal. We don't want them to send ships through the Suez Canal. Therefore, we'll essentially prepare a blockade for the Suez Canal, and if they come, we will fight them. That is a relatively easy thing for the Royal Navy to do. It knows how to fight, it knows how to concentrate ships, it knows how to guard a specific entrance or a particular tactical choke point. That is very easy. But that is a relatively limited thing compared to a general war with Italy. Because what do you do if you fight a general naval war with Italy? Do you try a close blockade? Well, we know that isn't going to work because of submarines and mines. Do you try a more distant blockade? Well, okay, we've got the Suez Canal, we've got Gibraltar, we can lock them into the Mediterranean, but is that perhaps too much operational space for the Italian Navy? But if we're going to go a bit closer, well, we've got Malta, we have to protect that, but where do we draw the line? Do we try and say, bottle them up using something like Corsica and say, okay, we'll let them have the central Mediterranean, but we're going to take the eastern and western ends off of them? Or do we try and press them closer? Where are our lines of resistance? Do we occupy somewhere like Suda Bay? Do we try and base something out of Malta or not? What ships do we use? Do we use a submarine blockade line? Do we use a cruiser blockade line? How does aircraft factor into all of this? What about the Italian possessions in North Africa? Although you don't need a intricately detailed war plan in the manner of some of the US ones, you do need at least some idea of what on earth you're actually going to do to Italy in the event of a war with Italy, other than if they send ships out, we'll blow them up. And that's the bit that was lacking, partly because of funding issues, partly because, as I said, the tactical and strategic focus was very much on Japan for a lot of the interwar period, and partly also, if we're being completely honest, because there were political pressures which essentially amounted to, we don't want there to be a war in Europe, therefore if we pretend that there isn't going to be a war in Europe, and therefore we don't plan for a war in Europe, then somehow this will magically make it that there won't be an actual war in Europe. And when those political pressures are coming from the same people who control the purse strings to your budget, suddenly, you know, coming up with a detailed strategy on how to deal with Germany or Italy drops off the radar a little bit, and you focus instead more on just making sure you have the ships with the money that you're being provided, and hope that you can come up with strategy later on. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, you've mentioned in the past that the height of a funnel on a ship affects the power output of the ship, and anything that lowers the height, such as damage, lowers the power output. Given that, how did early carriers with movable funnels, such as Ranger, deal with lower power when conducting flight operations? Also, is it possible to calculate how much power was lost when Ranger lowered her funnels or a Courageous class switched its exhaust position? I know such a calculation is possible, but unfortunately I do not know the formulas that would be used. So while I can tell you that yes, it should be possible to calculate overall power loss by, in the Ranger's case, lowering her funnels sideways or Courageous switching exhausts, I don't know exactly how much that would be. You do have to factor in with something like Ranger in that although you are losing height, you're not losing overall contained length, which does help a little bit. But the other thing you've got to factor in is that as you progress through the 20th century, and to a lesser extent in the 19th, but mostly in the 20th, you're dealing more and more with either combination draft or forced draft engines and, well, boilers more specifically. So natural draft is where the height of the funnel affects things the most, because it's the height of the funnel which is causing the draw, or the draft, which is drawing the air up from the boilers. So if the funnel is lower, then you get less efficient combustion, which means you need more fuel, and therefore for the amount of fuel you're using at any given time, you'll get less power. And then as time goes on, the introduction of forced draft, initially just to give you a little bit extra if you really need to move fast, but then later on as a more permanent feature to maintain pressure down in the boiler room. So if you go on to, say, HMS Belfast or an Iowa class or something like that, you'll see there are big fans that are designed to provide a positive pressure, and that's, you know, permanent forced draft in the boiler rooms to get more power output. That somewhat takes over. It doesn't entirely take over, because the natural draft is still a factor. It's just being enhanced by the forced draft. And there's also the other fact, which is that even if you're operating on a very heavily forced draft ship, if you get a shell through a funnel, for instance, you've now created an increased area through which pressure can escape. So if you're artificially upping the pressure in the boiler rooms using forced draft to help you get power and relying less on your natural draft, battle damage will still result, you know, there's more surface area through which the high pressure gas can escape, therefore it will escape faster, therefore the pressure in the boiler room will drop, therefore your power output will drop. In the case of something like Ranger, obviously it's not battle damage, so you're not changing the overall surface area through which the exhaust is escaping, but the height is going to be somewhat reduced. But given the time that Ranger was constructed, you could potentially compensate for that somewhat, either by just accepting you have a higher fuel consumption during that period, and or by increasing the power to your forced draft blowers to compensate for the lack of height. So if you did it cleverly, and given that obviously these are design features on these carriers, you would think they'd anticipate this, you could maintain your power output through a combination of either slightly increasing the amount of oil you're introducing to the boilers and or increasing forced draft, which would allow you to continue to conduct flight ops without an overall loss of power, but you would be using other resources to do so. David Pierce asks, how do naval architects compute the weight and height, or the metacentric height, of a ship during the design process, and why do they sometimes get stability calculations, such as with USS Midway's later refits or treaty destroyers, etc., so embarrassingly wrong? Computing the metacentric height is actually a relatively easy equation. The metacentric height is equal to the center of buoyancy plus, and then if you imagine imaginary brackets, the second moment of area of the water plane. And the water plane is essentially, if you imagine looking at a ship at the water line, then you cut the ship at that level, and then you look at, you know, the resulting cross section. If you're looking down on top of it, that surface area is the water plane, and then that's divided by the volume of the displacement of the ship. So you've only got three variables to calculate the metacentric height. Relatively easy. The problem comes in the what those variables are, because each of those variables has to be calculated. So working out where is the center of buoyancy is quite complex. Working out the second moment of area of the water plane is quite a complex calculation. The volume of the displacement in meters is probably the least complicated, although it's still relatively complicated because it depends on how precise you want to do it. There are some ways of working out the volume of displacement relatively crudely, but if you wanted to do, say, an intermediate level, you could take a look at the water line, or the legend waterline LWL, and then look at frame drawings of the ship and go via each frame. And if you know the spacing of the frame, then you can do some very basic calculations to essentially work out an approximate midpoint between frames, take that surface area, multiply by the distance. That will give you a relatively decent idea of the approximate volume of that slice, repeat for all the slices, i.e. frame by frame by frame, and that will give you the approximate volume of displacement in meters. But then of course there are even more advanced methods which you probably want to do for this kind of thing to round that figure out even more precisely. So there's a lot of individual rather complex calculations that go into a relatively simple calculation for metacentric height. When it comes to the stability calculations, well, that's a whole other set of issues, because you've got the metacentric height, you've got the center of buoyancy, you've got the center of gravity. You've got to work out all of those, and of course the center of buoyancy doesn't relate to the metacentric height. The metacentric height relates to the center of buoyancy, but you have to calculate center of gravity and center of buoyancy separately, and then use one to calculate metacentric height. And further calculations as well for overall stability. The problems you get when you sometimes get the stability calculation so badly wrong usually comes down to either, in the case of something like the Hunt-class destroyers, somebody rushing and not doing the multiple checks, because you're supposed to have multiple independent people doing the calculations, and then obviously if one of them gets something wrong, hopefully you'll catch it. So if you skip that process and you just have one person do the calculations and they get it wrong, then you're stuffed. But you can do the calculations perfectly correctly and still get the wrong result if people are not giving you the right information, because the weight of every single component that the ship is made up of has to be known. And if people are adding random things without telling you, or they are putting in things that they've told you about, but in actual fact the weight is substantially different, then that can mess up your calculations. Because, say, for example, take a really big one, as far as I'm aware, didn't happen in real life, but theoretically could have done. If somebody is building a ship with 5 big main battery turrets, and let's say the front armor plate of the face is going to be 13 inches thick, you know that weight, you know that's position on the ship, you can make your calculations based on that. If someone then decides, actually, I'm going to make that plate 15 inches thick, but doesn't tell you doing the stability calculations, well, then your stability calculations will be accurate for the data you've been given, but won't be accurate for the ship as built. Nothing has been added elsewhere, but there is additional mass where the turrets are, which isn't factored into your calculations. And the other thing that sometimes happens is what you might call displacement creep. So you might do a set of calculations for the designed armament and loadout, and everyone goes, okay, that's fine, great, fantastic. And you might say to them, well, based on these calculations, you have a margin here of, let's say for a destroyer, 40 tons. So an additional 40 tons could be installed at roughly this level, and it will still be stable, but anything beyond that, and it won't be. Unfortunately, what can then happen is that people who, especially if they're in a rush, are not quite as expert as you, might go, okay, well, we're going to add 10 tons there, and we're going to add 20 tons there. But what they might not have realized is that, yes, you said 40 tons at this level, but that 20 tons, that might be a combination radar and fire control system that they've stuck 40 feet up the superstructure or the mast much higher, which has a commensurately greater effect on stability. So you might actually be over the stability margin already, even though you've actually only added 30 tons to things. Or even if they're sensible and they're keeping everything, say, if you've said you've got 40 tons of additional weight that you can add at main deck level before stability becomes an issue, if everybody has heard that, then you might have somebody go, well, okay, I think I can elevate the main battery further from, let's say, 70 degrees to a full 90 degrees for better anti-aircraft defense. But those additional mounts are going to cost another, let's say, 20 tons in weight overall. But somebody else goes, oh, yeah, well, you know, he said we had 40 tons, so I think we're going to upgrade the torpedo launcher from a quad to a quintuple launcher. And that adds, let's say, arbitrarily another 10 tons. And then someone else goes, oh, well, you know, we had 40 tons of displacement, so I'm going to add a couple of twin Bofors, and that might add another 15 tons. And someone else comes along and goes, well, you know, we had 40 tons spare and there's this little bit of open deck space. I think I'm going to extend the superstructure a bit to give the crew a bit more of a sheltered area. That's going to add another 5 tons. And then someone comes along and goes, well, you know, we've got this 40-ton spare displacement. I think we can install a backup radio set for better communication. And that's going to add another couple of tons. And so everybody's adding their own little bits, all thinking they've got enough of a margin, but collectively, suddenly, you've added 60, 70 tons of weight and the thing is unstable. And one final error that crops up more than it does is sometimes the stability calculations are only done for one condition. So, for example, you might do the stability calculations assuming that the ship is fully loaded. So, maximum load of fuel, maximum load of shells, maximum load of food supplies, crew, etc., etc. And the ship might meet the stability requirements at that point. But if someone hasn't done a series of calculations reflecting different amounts of weight from light loaded all the way to fully loaded, what you might end up is, you know, something like what happened to some of the German destroyers, where they might just about have tipped the scales with marginally acceptable stability in calm seas in a fully loaded condition, but then as they burn off fuel, obviously the fuel is mostly stored deep in the ship, and now all of a sudden proportionally the top is considerably heavier than the bottom compared to when it's fully loaded, and now they are unacceptably stable, and in fact very unstable. And suddenly you discover that yes, you have this arbitrary amount of fuel in your fuel tanks, but you need to keep a bunch of it unburned because otherwise you're just going to flip upside down. Runon asks, if I recall correctly, the main battery layout for the Nelsons was chosen to minimise citadel without compromising the thermal break between the magazines and the engineering spaces. However, pictures of the Nelsons in transit show sea turret with its guns facing forward. Wouldn't it have been more space efficient to put the guns facing to the rear in transit, thus moving C barbette closer to B barbette? Or do firing angles make this a bad idea? Well, every ship design is a compromise, and yes, there are absolute optimizations you can do to save maximal weight, especially with an all-forward gun ship, but eventually some of those are going to impact on your combat capability. Now, with regards to the Nelson's layout, their initial variant, because there were several variants of the O3 design that would eventually become the Nelsons, and the initial variants actually had, if you like, C turret, the aftmost, as the super firing one, because it was essentially F3, but slower with 16-inch guns and a bit more armour. But it was decided that, although this actually represented a more efficient layout of guns, that they would instead make B turret the super firing one to improve the rear arcs of fire, because having B turret be super firing and thus able to aim backwards over C turret, if we're going to call it C, which we will for the moment, obviously B turret being further forward gave you finer arcs of fire aft than C turret would be able to give you. So that was one example of a compromise which shied away from absolute efficiency. But essentially you had a big chunk of efficiency in terms of weight savings being given to you by just having an all-forward design generally, and then little bits of that were clawed back for combat effectiveness. And one of the things you've got to realise, of course, is that the magazines, particularly the powder magazines for a turret, are actually considerably greater in terms of floor area than the barbette itself. And so there is only a limited amount of clustering you can do. So yes, in theory, you could cluster all the barbettes nice together. So you have A and then B super firing over A and then C backed right up onto B. And that would give you a really compact layout of the barbettes. But at that point, B turrets particularly wouldn't have anywhere near enough surface area lower down in the ship for its magazines, and you're going to end up with spread. And that spread is a limiting factor unless you want to start dialing down on the amount of propellant and therefore amount of shells that you're going to carry, or you're going to start stacking them higher, which starts to get worryingly close to the waterline and so forth. So there's not a huge amount of actual saving in terms of the vulnerabilities down below that you get from having essentially a default aft-facing C turret. And, of course, it would restrict sea turrets' capabilities of firing ahead. It would give you slightly better aft fire arcs, because now B and C would have pretty decent fire arcs, although B's fire arcs aft would still be superior. But it would compromise your head angles for firing. And as far as the Nelsons are concerned, given that you don't get all that much benefit in your magazine arrangements down below, it's better to have them laid out the way that they did, because that gives you better firing angles for both a head fire and also a little bit more survivability for the battery in terms of a direct hit. Because if you imagine, let's say all the turrets are trained out to one side or the other because you're engaging somebody, if all the barbettes are clustered very close together and somebody, say, takes an aim at the center point on B barbette, then there's actually quite a lot of spread that shell can do locally, and it will still hit a turret or a barbette, and potentially a significant explosion in B turret or B barbette might, if they're all clustered together, might actually cripple the entire ship's main battery. Whereas it's admittedly a smaller consideration, but having C barbette and C turret slightly further away from A and B means that even if something catastrophic happens to A and B, you still at least will retain some fighting capability. Jellicoe Katz asks, Britain borrowed some monitors that they were building for Brazil at the outbreak of World War I. What did Brazil want monitors for in the first place, and what did they have in mind for them? Fairly simple, actually. Brazil has an incredibly extensive river system, primarily made up of the Amazon and its tributaries, but there's the Rio Grande and a few other rivers as well. And most of these rivers are characterized by, in places, having actually relatively shallow depths. And certainly in the early 20th century, Brazil, which shares land borders with almost every other South American country, had, shall we say, tensions with quite a number of them. And those river systems extend past Brazil into those other countries, which of course means those other countries could potentially sail down them to attack Brazil, or vice versa. Plus there was some degree of internal unrest in certain sectors of Brazil through which rivers ran, and so for all of these reasons and a few more, the Brazilians liked to maintain a small fleet of river monitors, because that allowed them to exert quite heavy firepower as well as semi-reliable transportation up and down the river systems without having to build massive road networks across the entirety of their territory. And one or two of those monitors, particularly the Parnaíba, are still in service to this day, although Parnaíba wasn't one of the 3 monitors that were under construction in 1914 in the UK. Those became the Humber class, which you can see here. Eric Van Dooting asks, when I-26 torpedoed Saratoga in August 1942, she initially had an attack set up from only 1,000 metres away, but due to a mistake by one of her crew, only 5 of the 6 torpedoes were ready. By the time she submerged and returned to periscope depth for the eventual attack, she had to fire from further away and only achieved 1 hit out of a 6 torpedo spread. Was there any technical reason why she could not have simply fired a 5 torpedo spread when she had a chance from such close range, or was it more a matter of it being the captain's decision to wait until she could fire a full spread? I did a fair bit of digging for this, but I can't find anything in any English language source that goes much beyond saying that there was some kind of error in the loading of the 6th torpedo, and it doesn't go into any particular detail about what exactly this error was or why this forced the sub to break off until she could fire all 6. I have got a lead on some Japanese language sources which might go into more detail, considering they're a lot more extensive, but it takes time to get hold of them, because finding out which Japanese sources exist and then finding somewhere on the internet where I can actually purchase said book in a manner that will actually allow for shipping to the UK, that's quite difficult. And so it may be that there are details available in Japanese that I don't know about, but hopefully I'll find out eventually when potentially I get my hands on an almost 1,000-page book on the history of Japanese submarines, but there you go. In the interim, while I wouldn't like to speculate on an exact reason without a source to back it up, from having spoken to a number of people who have either served aboard or currently operate submarines, i.e. they either have served on more recent subs or they're operating museum subs like the COD, there is something in the back of my mind that's going, there are certain errors in drill or errors in loading or perhaps steps in the loading wherein you might have the other torpedo tubes loaded, but you wouldn't want to necessarily fire them, possibly because of the interlinked nature of some of the systems. But I can't recall exactly what those circumstances are. So if you happen to be watching and you either are or were a sailor involved with torpedoes on a more recent sub, or you happen to be from, COD, Bakuna, etc., Lionfish, one of the various memorial subs out there, and you happen to know of an error in loading torpedoes or a stage in loading torpedoes whereby you might have one torpedo tube in the process of loading and that would prevent you from launching 5 other perfectly fine, ready-to-go torpedo tubes, please let us know in the comments below so we can all get some idea of what might have gone on. Real MCB asks, why did the 2 8-inch armed Thai coastal defence ships perform so badly against the old French Lamotte Picquet? You often noted how terrible French cruisers were until Algerie, so was this a case of an even worse ship design on the Japanese and Thai designers' part? Well, a big part of it was only the Thonburi, one of the 2, actually managed to engage Lamotte Picquet. The other one was on its way but didn't arrive until it was all over, so it was a 1v1 duel. Then on top of that, you have the fact, as you can probably see here from this photograph, the Thai coast defence ships were very small. There are significant numbers of destroyers that are dimensionally larger than she is, and there are even a few destroyers that displace more than she does. She's essentially a medium-sized destroyer hull with light cruiser, maybe, armour slapped onto her, and a couple of twin 8-inch turrets. So she's not exactly going to be the world's best gun platform in the first place for such large weapons, coupled with the fact that she only has 4 of them, so you can just about get off a decent salvo, but a decent salvo from a not particularly brilliant gun platform. And of course, the rate of fire is going to be relatively low, whereas with the Lamotte Picquet, she has 8 guns, and each of those guns can fire somewhat faster. So in a race to see who is going to find the range first, Lamotte Picquet has pretty much every advantage. And although the Thonburi does have some armour, it's not a huge amount, so 6-inch gunfire is still a serious threat to her, especially given her small size. 6-inch hits would compromise potentially significant portions of the ship. And that essentially adds up to enough problems for the ship such that in a running gunfight, periodically interrupted by islands getting in the way, the chances of her taking a hit first compared to the French cruiser go up quite significantly, and that's basically what happens. She gets hit repeatedly by French 6-inch gunfire without being able to land a hit on Lamotte Picquet. Now, if she had managed to land a full salvo of 4 8-inch shells on Lamotte Picquet, then that would be a completely different thing. But although Lamotte Picquet really does not have all that much in the way of protection, if she's not hit, it doesn't really matter. Alex Moskovitz asks, before I get to my question, I want to add some more info to last month's question about rangefinders, binoculars and telescopes. The Carnegie Science Centre has an ancient telescope that I was told had been used on a warship. Now, I don't have any hard proof of this, but it does have a number of features that make it useless as an astronomical telescope. It gives you a choice of 3 eyepieces which are mounted on swivel mechanisms permanently affixed to the scope's focal point. Therefore, you get 3 different options for magnification. But now on to my question, how did navies decide how many admirals to have and when to promote officers to new admirals? It's another one of those questions where you have to preface it by it varies considerably based on what navy and what time you're looking at. Because older navies that start out way back will tend to develop their systems organically. So, for example, in the Royal Navy, initially, an admiral position was essentially transitory. When you needed someone to take command of the Royal Fleet, then they might be appointed as an admiral, and when everything had been done and the campaign was sorted, the ships were back in storage, then that rank would cease. As time went on, an admiral as the supreme commander of the Navy on an ongoing basis might be a position that would be given to somebody, and now you have a permanent admiral. And then as the fleet gets larger, the original idea of admiral, vice admiral, and rear admiral corresponded to the center, forward, and rear portions of the fleet, divided up much as medieval armies were. In medieval armies would have three what they called battles or formations, a vanguard, a middle, and a rear guard. And similarly, you were supposed to have the admiral in the center, the vice admiral up front, and the rear admiral, unsurprisingly, in the rear. And they would control each of their formations, but the vice admiral and the rear admiral would be taking their directions themselves from the admiral who was in the center formation, as fleets became larger and more unwieldy. But then, of course, as fleets got larger still, and the idea of the battle fleet comprising only enough ships that three admirals could control it all in one formation at one time, well, that became a little bit redundant, so now there were more and more admirals, because now you potentially needed as many admirals as you could have battle squadrons. You needed enough full admirals that your various potential fleets could all be commanded appropriately. And then you'd have, obviously, vice admirals and rear admirals and smaller formations that might be independent of a battle fleet or constitute a small battle fleet in and of themselves, which might be considered appropriate for a vice admiral or a rear admiral to command completely. And then, obviously, again, as the fleet expands, you're not necessarily going to have an admiral on sea duty 24/7 from the day they achieve the rank to the day they die, so you need more admirals than you have flag positions at sea, which now means you have admirals on land, so therefore certain positions on land are then rated as worthy of an admiral. So, commander-in-chief of a dockyard that's particularly important to the Navy or something like that. And it just grows from there in a very organic fashion. If you have navies that are a bit later to the game, they obviously can then start out with the understanding that you do need admirals, but then they can also then dictate, okay, well, we have decided we want to have a fleet of this size and we want to have this type of admiral. So for a good chunk of time, actually, in the US Navy, even up into the interwar period, the rank of full admiral at sea was not actually a permanent appointment. So the higher echelons of flag rank were something that you would assume for command of a particular ship or a particular formation, or a fleet maybe, but then once that command finished, whereas in, say, the Royal Navy, if you were made a full admiral and placed in command of, say, the Home Fleet, when your term in command of the Home Fleet finished, you were still a full admiral. In the US Navy, your rank would actually drop back to whatever it had been before you took that particular command. And the other thing, which again is a transitory thing, particularly more so in the Age of Sail, is that in order to have effective officers at sea, because a lot of the time, especially in peacetime, promotion was based purely on seniority, if someone just decided to stay in the service and keep taking the paycheck, you could end up with, admirals who fully occupied your actual necessary admiral command slots, but they might be in their 70s, maybe even their 80s, and then you have captains in their 50s and 60s, and they don't want to leave the service either, but they're stopping, commanders and lieutenants or lieutenants, depending on the Navy, from advancing up themselves. So you've got this logjam. So at times you would have, for example, in the Royal Navy, what they would call a promotion to Admiral of the Yellow, which was essentially, yes, we are granting you a flag rank, and now that you have a flag rank, it is inappropriate for you to command a single ship. However, since we don't have enough fleet commands or squadron commands to go around, you're going to have to come ashore for a bit, which is fairly standard practice. That then frees up the captaincy slot in a ship, which allows some poor sap to be advanced to the rank of captain, and everybody else moves up a slot. And then what you essentially do is quietly go, okay, this guy, never really is like fleet command or squadron command material, but we had to get him out of the captain slot to free up space for other people. So now he has an admiral rank, he has a little bit more pay, and especially on half pay. So now we're just essentially going to keep him ashore until he retires or dies. And of course, outside of that, depending again on whether in your peacetime or wartime, promotion of someone from captain or commodore to admiral might come as a result of a certain amount of seniority, might come as the result of a certain amount of competency being assessed, because again, in various navies, including the US Navy, reaching up to the level of captain in the time period the channel covers could be fairly easily done by regular progression, but then there would be a sort of an assessment bar beyond which only a few would progress to admiral. And then obviously in wartime, if admirals either got themselves killed or proved to be incompetent and could be dismissed or safely benched, then you might have far more rapid promotion to admiral from captains and commodores who'd shown a lot of promise. Samuel G. Gurley asks, did the Royal Navy blockade Vichy shipping in the Mediterranean, and if not, did they try to prevent strategic materials from reaching Germany via Vichy ports? Yes, there was in fact a British blockade against Vichy France and Vichy French territories, although its effectiveness waxed and waned somewhat, because of course the British were quite cognizant of the fact that if they allowed Vichy French ports to remain open, then any blockading attempts they took against the Germans would be thoroughly ineffective, because the increasingly collaborationist Vichy French regime would simply allow German ships or ships trading in goods that the Germans ultimately wanted to land in Vichy-controlled ports, and then the goods would be transported straight to Nazi Germany, and they weren't going to allow that. Of course, essentially this re-invoked the total blockade of Europe minus Spain and Portugal, which the British had adopted during the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars, just with slightly different flavours. But, as I said, the effectiveness waxed and waned, partly because at times, obviously, there were draws on Royal Navy ships to do things a little bit more proactive, like escort their own convoys or attack Regia Marina formations or Kriegsmarine formations or go after the Japanese. And, of course, therefore, at times, the blockade on Vichy French territories was a little bit looser. And also, which might come as a surprise to some people, although maybe not all, Admiral Darlan had gone down an increasingly degenerating circle of Anglophobia during the period of the Vichy French regime, which seems to have kicked off somewhat before Mers el-Kabir and all of that. And at various points, he was threatening to essentially provoke open conflict between Britain and Vichy France by, well, one of his repeated threats was to take the French fleet, form a convoy of ships going to Vichy France, then sail the Vichy fleet out into the Atlantic to meet it, and then sail this entire armed convoy through the Straits of Gibraltar heading for Toulon, and thus provoke the British into either opening fire on the French fleet to prevent the blockade or from being broken, or having their blockade actually broken. And occasionally he'd throw in, threats to attack Gibraltar on the way and so forth. Now, obviously, the Royal Navy was more than capable of dealing with the Marine Nationale, especially given that some of their more critical assets like Richelieu were distributed across the planet. But fighting even the Vichy French fleet that remained at Toulon was not something the Royal Navy really needed to be doing when they had the Kriegsmarine, the Regia Marina, and the Imperial Japanese Navy to also fight. And so there was, via the Americans as interlocutors, a little bit of a relaxation of the blockade. The British obviously didn't want to be giving in to Darlan's demands, because they understood very well that the minute you gave Darlan an inch, he would take a mile, as he was very rapidly, as I say, not only becoming more and more Anglophobic, but switching over more and more from being someone who was trying to preserve Vichy France to becoming an open collaborator with the Germans. But the British did agree that basic foodstuffs would be allowed through the blockade, but anything more complex than that could be used for war material would still be restricted, which took a little bit of the wind out of Darlan's sails, because one of the ways he was planning on selling the whole enterprise to the French public was to tell them, well, hey, you know, the British are starving you out for no good reason. And then the British turn around and say, okay, fine, we won't starve you out, but you're still not importing machinery and, you know, raw materials and rare metals and so forth, which we know you're just going to go and sell to the Germans. HMS Albatross asks, I'm currently reading Norman Friedman's The British Battleship 1906-46, which has been very helpful in explaining both why and how some decisions that have puzzled me were made for some of these ships. At a number of points he mentions there was a feeling in the upper echelons of the Royal Navy that the battleship and armoured cruiser were converging before the advent of the battlecruiser. I'd always understood that the development of the battlecruiser was mostly driven by Admiral Fisher's views on the direction that capital ships should develop. Is Friedman talking about the younger officers like Jellicoe here, or were there contemporaries of Fisher who weren't quite as conservative as most Victorian-era Royal Navy officers are usually portrayed? There's two elements to it. Firstly, there were a number of flag officers who thought like this, partly because they were part of Admiral Fisher's, what he used to call his fish pond, his kind of school of thought, which attracted various other officers like Jellicoe. So they were all expressing similar sentiments. And you've got to remember that Fisher's idea for what would eventually become the battlecruiser, i.e. some form of armoured cruiser battleship hybrid, whether that be exactly what Invincible turned out to be or something slightly different, they actually go back almost a decade or more before Invincible was actually built. So there's plenty of time for his ideas to disseminate amongst others. But also there was a tendency at times in British thought, from probably about the early 1880s onwards, to occasionally see that the armoured cruiser and the battleship were pulling together, but it tended to be something that would be seen and then not really acted upon, and then seen again and not really acted upon. And in part, although not in whole, it actually explains why the British stopped building armoured cruisers for a decent chunk of the very end of the 19th century. Because, you know, there were other reasons like cost, but a very important reason was that the British had totaled up the armour and armament of an armoured cruiser and the armour and armament of a battleship. Noticed how they were getting closer and closer and how the only real variable was speed, and the speed margin was actually closing with the latest developments in battleships. And so they'd concluded that actually the slightly faster double compound and then later triple compound engine battleships, which would now be able to approach the speed of what had previously been, you know, considered to be a cruiser's speed regimen, at least at the lower end, would essentially be doing roughly the same job as an armoured cruiser, and therefore there was no point in building armoured cruisers that were just slight flavour variations on what the British were building as battleships, which also wasn't helped by the fact that you had other people overseas, like the Italians, building battleships and listing them as battleships, but those ships had a little bit more speed and a little bit less armour and a little bit less firepower than the British standard idea of a battleship. And when you looked at those, like, say, the Italia, divining what exactly was the difference between the Italia and a really big armoured cruiser became very difficult. Obviously then things progressed and the British started building armoured cruisers again, but this kind of getting close and then further away and getting close and then further away did occasionally pop up in British thinking. But at the same time, it was Fisher and those who subscribed to his school of thought that took it from, they're getting a bit too close, and then now it's splitting again to, we actually think that combining these characteristics is a good thing and we should actively pursue it. Scott Jennings asks, as a general rule of thumb, how much research time do you budget for different kinds of content? Drydock questions versus 5-minute guides versus rum rations versus fun Fridays? And roughly what percentage of your research time in a given work goes towards each type of, in a given work week, goes towards each type of video? Also, when and how often do you pull questions from the Patreon Drydock thread for research and recording? If someone decides that they need to edit their question for phrasing, clarity, or simple grammatical correctness, roughly how long after posting do they have to do so? Well, while you all relax looking at a picture of my ideal library, if I ever had ridiculous amounts of money, in answer to your questions, I guess going from the last and then to the first, I start to pull questions from the Patreon Drydock for research and recording about a week and a half to 2 weeks after the opening of the thread. So if you want to edit your question, that is the absolute time limit. However, of course, I'm starting from the first responses. So as I'm working through them, obviously, if you asked your question somewhat later and you're 40, 50 questions down, then you've probably got another couple of weeks before I get round to that. Now, in terms of what percentage of your research time in a given work week goes towards each type of video, that's kind of related to how much research time do I budget. Well, in terms of budgeting, for the 5-minute guides, I generally budget maybe a day's worth of work to get one of those done. But sometimes it can be a lot less because it'll be a class or a ship that's very easy to find information on. And sometimes it can end up being a lot more. Although for something like a 5-minute guide where you essentially have to summarize and condense down a ship's entire design and operational history, or a class's entire design and operational history, into about 1,000 words, there's usually more than enough information out there from multiple reliable sources to make that relatively easy to pull off. However, there are some times when that exceeds my time budget. So, for example, with the recent video on the Spanish pre-dreadnought Pelayo, there is almost nothing reliable on Pelayo where I could cite sources and so forth in English. And so for that video, what I had to do was I ended up actually discovering 2 different books in Spanish that had been written on the Pelayo. I then had to find out where I could order them from, which meant navigating the Spanish side of the internet. So finding both that the books existed, who sold them, if they even were available, and if I bought them from those websites, could I buy them and get them shipped over to the UK? I then had to order the books once I found someone who would actually sell them, and then I had to wait for them to transit internationally and pay the appropriate charges, etc. Then I had the books in Spanish, then I had to scan the books in Spanish, then I had to run optical character recognition, and then I had to start translating them, and then I had to look at the translation and work out which bits of the translation were correct and which bits had messed up. And then I could use that information to help write the script for Pelayo. So that was probably, all told, about 2 days worth of work, but spaced out probably, I think I'd started that about 2 months ago when I knew that Pelayo was going to be a late December video. And most of that time in the interim was spent actually waiting for the books to arrive. And as I mentioned in the first half of this Drydock, because I'm working on multiple scripts at once, it's not a case of, well, this week I've got to do a Wednesday video because I Rum Ration, because that's always happens, and every other week I've got to do a Fun Friday, so I'm going to budget time for that particular video. It's more a case, I would say, that in any given week, I'm probably budgeting a day for the 5-minute guides, a day for the Drydock questions, and the other 3 days collectively are going into Rum Ration and Fun Friday scripts, with, of course, some variation on that theme given what each video is like. So if it's an easy 5-minute guide, like say for the Royal Sovereign class recently, that might take only half a day of me drafting a script and then double checking with several different sources. That gives me some extra time, and then obviously that extra time usually gets banked away, usually to put towards the Patreon Drydock, because obviously that's an awful lot more time involved, but sometimes will be put towards the Rum Ration or a Fun Friday, if depending on how difficult those videos are. And of course, some of the Rum Rations or Fun Fridays are stuff that I've already recorded, either in interviews or I've recorded by going out and visiting places. So obviously at that point, a lot of the work has already been done. So for a given work week, if I'm putting one of those videos together, it's usually a case of pulling the relevant video files in, giving them a quick listen to, double checking, adding pictures if appropriate, and job done. So that can actually maybe only take half a day, but then that just gives me more time to work on other scripts instead. So when it comes to probably the ones that take the longest amount of research time consistently, which is the Rum Rations, I might have only 2 days per week officially booked in for doing research, writing, editing, etc. However, it's not that I'm spending 2 days that week on that Wednesday's video. It'll be a case of, well, I've spent 4 hours on that script this week, 2 hours on it the next week, 8 hours on it the week after that, and so on, usually over the course of 6 to 8 weeks, maybe longer. And then that final output is actually considerably more than 2 days, but just spread out over weeks or months, occasionally years. The exception to that, of course, being stuff that the Patreon subscribers have voted on, because that's kind of, okay, right, they voted on that, that needs to be done this month, you better get a move on. And sometimes I've spent 14, 15-hour days tracking down research material and looking stuff up for those videos, just to make sure that the video is prepared in time. A good example of that was the recent video on Admiral Rozhesvensky. Now, I had a feeling that was going to be the winner by looking at the way the poll numbers were going before the poll officially closed, so that gave me a couple of weeks head start. But I spent, I don't know how long, first trying to find decent English language sources on his life story, and then when that failed, trying to navigate the Russian internet to try and find if there were any decent Russian language sources on his life. And then once I discovered there were a few, obviously linked in the video description for that video, then I had to go through a similar process to like with Pelayo. I had to go and find them, acquire them in some way, shape or form. Thank goodness for the Russian love of putting everything in PDFs. And then making sure that, well, make sure those files were secure and not some kind of Trojan or virus, because that's the other thing Russians love to do, apparently. And then once I'd got them, making sure they were digitized, OCR'd, scanned, translated, and then double check the coherence of the translation, and then go to work on working out what to include and what not to include. So yeah, that, I think, over the course of the, 5 weeks from when I twigged to the fact that that was probably going to be a video to actually getting that video up, I think that was probably about 5 to 6 solid days, 8 to 10 hour days work spread out over that time. Grummancat asks, with the aid of blueprints and computers, is it possible to create a computer model of HMS Captain, yes, that one, and calculate exactly where her metacentric height was and compare it with where it should have been? In theory, yes, but you would have to use a computer modelling software that could do volumetric calculations based on inputted densities. And you would need a lot more than just the blueprints. I mean, theoretically, if you have the deck-by-deck blueprints, which are still around, you could do a pretty decent 3D model with all the requisite compartments and guns and so forth in there. But, and obviously you know the rough densities of iron, steel, wood, etc., so you could put those in, but you would be taking certain assumptions about, how thick are these pipes, and exactly what thickness are the ribs and so forth. It would give you a rough idea, and it should average out, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that you could rely on to say this is exactly the metacentric height. But I believe that most of the documentation surrounding things like the weight of the engines, the weight of the turrets, and so forth, which obviously were used in the stability calculations, I think they are actually still around. So in theory, if you got your hands on those, you could then assign weights to objects. So you could create a basic 3D model of her engines or her boilers, for example, and go, okay, computer program, this item masses however many tons, and these guns mass this many tons, and so on and so forth. And thus, you would get a much more accurate idea of what the metacentric height actually was. Greg M. asks, regardless of functionality or service history, do you have a short list of warships from any era that the channel covers that you think looked especially good? Well, I have listed a number of good-looking warships in various dry docks in the past, But I would say if you're going to look for, let's say, World War II ships, top three would be Dunkirk and Strasbourg. Now, while they do look very similar to the Richelieus, I think from a front view, there's not really a lot to choose between the Dunkirks and the Richelieus. But if you're looking at it from a side view, the Dunkirks, to me, have a slightly more pleasing taper, whereas the Richelieus, with the big combined mainmast and funnel, there's something a little bit off compared to the Dunkirks. The Richelieus are still very good-looking ships, but compared to the Dunkirks, their aesthetics after the bridge are just a little bit better with the Dunkirks. Then, of course, you have HMS Hood. Whatever else you might think of her, she did look really good, and honestly, although she looks good in her historical configuration, I think she would have looked even better in her refit configuration. And although, as with many aesthetic things, my choices for top three vary somewhat depending as time goes on, I think the Italian heavy cruiser Bolzano really does deserve a spot up there. While a lot of modern Italian ships in World War II tended to look fairly good because the Italians do have a good sense for aesthetic, the Trentos and Zaras, in their various ways, because their superstructures do vary quite a bit, all have some things about the superstructure which I'm not necessarily entirely happy with. Whereas with the Bolzano, it's got the, to my mind at least, slightly nicer lines of a Trento, but with a superstructure that actually looks like someone thought it through rather than throwing something together out of a box of scraps. Volunteer per Order O'Sullivan asks, as there were 9 twin 13.5-inch gun turrets in storage when the Second World War began, would the Royal Navy be better served by 9 ships with 1 twin 13.5-inch gun turret each, 4 ships with 2 twin turrets, 3 ships with 3 twin turrets, 2 with 4 twin turrets, or 1 with 8 twin turrets in a double diamond arrangement a la K25F? Now, that one's actually a really difficult one. I mean, let's face it, ships with a single twin, that's going to be monitors. I don't think a single ship with 8 twin 13.5s would be that useful. Similarly, the Royal Navy does, well, it's got some monitors, it doesn't need more. I don't want to redo the Courageouses, but in miniature, so that leaves you with 3 ships with 3 twin 13.5-inch turrets, or 2 with 4. Now, initially, my heart says 3 ships with 3 twin 13.5s, i.e. mini Renowns. Those would both look really good, and having the extra hull could be used in a lot of different places. My only concern with that, which is why, even though having 2 ships is less valuable than 3, but having 4 twins, i.e. 8 guns, is better than having 6, apart from the salvo issues, is that 3 twin 13.5-inch turrets, aka 6 guns total, that would make for a really wonderful set of mini Renown cruiser killers, essentially kind of like the Japanese B-64, B-65 program. But at the same time, the firepower is just small enough that there would be a number of potential threats out there that I wouldn't necessarily be happy sending such ships against. So if you had a ship with 8 13.5-inch guns, I would probably happily throw that at a Scharnhorst. 6, I'm not so sure. Obviously, Renown did fairly well against the Scharnhorst, but she had 15-inch guns. I mean, the smaller ships would easily deal with any heavy cruiser-sized vessel up to and including a Deutschland, but when they're facing off against serious capital ships, if you are taking 6 13.5-inch guns into a fight with a Scharnhorst or a Cavour or a Duilio or even a Congo, you would be at something of a disadvantage. Whereas if you were to take an 8-gun ship into such a combat, then I would feel a lot more comfortable in giving at least even odds, if not better, considering that obviously these would be brand new ships. So potentially something like what you can see here that I quickly knocked up in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, as this kind of ship would either be a match or an overmatch for anything that pretty much isn't a frontline battleship. So, Bismarck, Littorio, Yamato, obviously, might struggle against Issei prior to its conversion into a hybrid abomination, but would probably have a speed advantage over the Isseis at least. But anything else it could pretty much go toe-to-toe with quite happily. Peter Guy asks, in the Battle of Drydock Sound in World War II, the German heavy cruiser Blucher capsized and sank after having been hit by obsolete Whitehead torpedoes from Oscarsborg Fortress in a stunning defence of the German invasion of Norway. I'm wondering why she sank so quickly. Was it because of lack of anti-torpedo defences, a failure to secure all watertight doors and hatches because they didn't expect resistance, the presence of the 800 or so infantry on board for the invasion, or some or all of the above? And did the hits from the 11-inch gun batteries, etc. play any role? It was a combination, I think, of two primary causes. The obvious thing is, yes, she was hit by 2 torpedoes, and the Hippo class doesn't really have all that much in the way of anti-torpedo defences, so she was breached around the machinery spaces, which is always a bad place for torpedoes to breach, and that made her take on quite a significant list. However, on paper, that in and of itself should not have spelled her end, because while there was a lot of water admitted, she, in theory, had the pumping capacity and the counterflowing capability to keep ahead of the incoming water and at least stabilise the ship. However, the crew were supplemented by soldiers for the invasion and their supplies, which were stored on the open decks, and the 11-inch gunfire that had hit her earlier, as well as obviously doing damage to the ship, had started fires, particularly around the aviation facilities. Those fires had spread, and they had included a whole bunch of the supplies, particularly some of the explosive supplies for the army troops on the deck, which made the fires even worse, which of course meant that there was damage control crews fighting those fires, albeit not really very successfully, but drawing their attention away from being able to help with patching up the ship down below. The explosions and the fires has obviously done their own damage to the ship generally, but more particularly, as the fires continued to spread, they eventually would touch off one of her secondary battery magazines, and when that went up, it damaged a whole bunch of bulkheads and so forth, which allowed the flooding from the torpedoes hits to spread to a point where the ship was completely unsalvageable. There was too much water in her, and over she went. So it was a combination of pretty much every factor. The watertight doors and hatches, broadly speaking, were shut once she was engaged and then hit, because it did take a little while for her to go down. But pretty much every other factor played into accounts. And then obviously once the magazines went up, the fact that the doors had been closed didn't really help all that much, because they had been blown open, all the bulkheads around them had been demolished. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have created an alcoholic honey-based beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, between 1922 and the end of the period covered by the channel, which 3 to 5 ships, built or modernised, would you save from the Breakers Yard or Bikini Atoll based on engineering grounds, i.e. the first successful attempt at a certain capability, or ship type, the archetypical ship of a certain type, or the peak of a certain type of ship, or possibly just so hilariously bad it almost beggars belief. So based purely on those criteria, i.e. some kind of engineering first or peak, as opposed to the historical value, which obviously would make me say immediately Warspite and Enterprise taking up 2 of those potentially 5 slots, I would therefore go with USS Saratoga. Now, she would actually be a really interesting ship to preserve, because you'd have a preserved example of capital scale turboelectric drive, you'd have a preserved example of a US battle cruiser hull, you'd have a preserved example of the Washington Cherry Tree capital ships, and you'd have a preserved example of the first generation of true fleet carrier, and it would be an absolutely colossal ship, so you could have plenty of museum space aboard. So definitely Saratoga. I would also save either Nelson or Rodney, whichever one I could get my hands on. They are obviously the first all-forward dreadnought type or post-dreadnought battleship. Obviously there are a few all forward because they only have a single gun turret types in the pre-Dreadnought period, but you said from 1922 to the end of the period, so that would be either Nelson or Rodney, both as being a British battleship and also the all-forward arrangement. Ideally Rodney, if she could be made available because of her role in killing Bismarck, but Nelson if not. I'd probably also save a Capitani Romani class cruiser, purely because from engineering perspectives, it's right in the middle between being an extremely large destroyer or an extremely small cruiser, and pretty unique in that space, so she'd definitely be preserved. I'd probably keep one of the I-400 submarines, the Japanese ones. Those would be quite amusing to look around, and of course, I mean, they're not the first submarine aircraft carrier, but they're the first purpose-built submarine aircraft carrier. I mean, you've got obviously submarines like M2 before, converted, and you've got submarines which are designed to carry an aircraft, but the I-400s are really the first built and put into service that are designed to carry multiple aircraft for the explicit purpose of bombing things. And then I think I would be torn between either preserving an Abdiel-class mine layer, because of their ridiculous super destroyer on steroids, but we're a mine layer, and also not used as a mine layer, but also incredibly ridiculously quick paradigm. But at the same time, I'm slightly concerned that may be playing a little too close to the mark, with the same reason I'm preserving a Capitani Romani, even though the two ships would have very different roles and purposes. The sarcastic, dark humour part of me also potentially suggests I might want to preserve the Graf Zeppelin, Germany's aircraft carrier, as kind of a monument to how not to build an aircraft carrier. And maybe when you step on board, you get an adapted version of the of that line, that scene from George of the Jungle, so be adapted to, Graf Zeppelin, German aircraft carrier, classic evidence of engineering comedy. Now is the point where we throw our heads back and laugh. Ready? Yeah. And it kind of continues like that throughout the tour. Prusy Antique asks, the Mersey-class frigate showed the limits of wooden construction. However, I've seen it mentioned by historians like Andrew Lambert that three-deckers were built longer because of the extra deck, which presumably adds to the structural stiffness of the ship. Would a two- or three-decker version of the Merseys have been better ships? And, if they're too long, what would be, in your estimation, the maximum structurally sound length for a Victorian-era two- or three-decker ship of the line? Since there seems to have been a big length gap between the Mersey-class and HMS Victoria, or the Duncan-class ships of the line. In theory, yes, you could build two, and three-decker warships longer than single-decker frigates, because of the additional structural strength afforded. I mean, that's one of the reasons why even, three-deckers could be longer than two-deckers, for example. However, there are limits to this, and this is where material science comes into play more than structural engineering, because, having essentially, I know they're not iron ships, but go with me for a second, multiple hull girders, the essential box formed by each individual deck, helps with the strength of ships. There is also what the ship is actually made of to consider. And once you get out past a certain length, it turns out that at least with the shaping and the stresses that you have with a ship that's actually supposed to sail anywhere, with, a vaguely pointy front and a vaguely rounded stern, etc., it basically gets to a point where the stresses and the strains imposed on the hull material, in this case obviously wood, become too great for the wood itself to withstand, and the wood starts to fail, seams start to split, etc., etc. So while adding a second deck, for example, to a Mersey-class frigate second gun deck would make it a stiffer ship, it would also add a whole ton of additional weight, which I think would actually lead to seam splitting and so forth, perhaps even more so, because there's even more stress on the weight further down. When you look at pretty much any wooden ship of any description that goes above 300 feet, unless they're lake or river craft that are subjected to very little in the way of stress, almost all the oceanic ones have a very short service life, and almost all of them end up sinking in one way, shape or form, usually because of reasons either directly or indirectly related to structural failure. I think if you were going to build a 2 or 3 decker ship of the line out of mostly wood, the practical maximum length is likely to come down to what exact technology you're using. So if you're doing it pure wooden and actually without auxiliary engines, you might get more than with auxiliary engines, because one of the problems with the Orlando and Mersey, the frigates, was that they had this heavy machinery right amidships which concentrated a lot of stress. If you took that out, they might actually have had better sailing qualities and durability, even if as warships they would have been less useful. So if you're doing a purely wood or mostly wood construction, you probably don't want to include the auxiliary engines, at which point I reckon you could maybe get 270 to 280 feet as a maximum. If you did what some of the later attempts to get wooden ships over 300 feet did, which is to include massive amounts of iron or later steel strapping, as well as the more general wooden construction, you might be able to extend that further. But again, you'd run into issues of the wood itself starting to fail as a material. So even with extremely heavy wood or steel strapping and reinforcement, I think maybe you could push a 3-decker up to maybe 290, 300 feet, but I wouldn't want to go any further than that. Randy Topeka asks, we all love to poke fun at Kamchatka for having possibly the most incompetent crew, but in all of your studies, are there any ships that stand out to you as possibly having the most competent crew, an anti-Kamchatka, if you will? There are a few that stand out. I mean, whatever they were feeding the Renown-class battlecruiser crews in World War II definitely needs to be studied and replicated, because okay, yeah, Repulse went down with Force Z, but you look at how many torpedoes and bombs she dodged before she was finally caught. You know, that's an almost unprecedented record, and she wasn't exactly the most maneuverable ship to begin with. And then you look at Renown, again, you know, a ship that on paper really has no business confronting a pair of Scharnhorst, but not only manages to confront them, but manages to win the engagement. And Renown has a lot of that in her life, of, especially in World War II, of on paper you really should lose this fight, but Renown either goes on to win the fight or at least call it a draw. Then you've got the various crews of the USS Constitution in the War of 1812. They generally put in a pretty good showing, especially her final crew, because she does have a number of crews during that period. I would say her final crew in the action against Cyan and Levant, and then her subsequent escape from Newcastle and Leander, are really good examples of an extremely competent crew working very quickly. I think also there has to be plenty of credit to the crew of USS Franklin. Now, of course, the ship did get rather horribly bombed, but given that they seem to have a raging narcissist as a captain who really was more hindrance than help, and the ship was, on fire and exploding, and half of them had been blown over the side by said explosions, the fact that they kept that ship afloat was really something of a miracle. And if you want to go really far back, perhaps, to, let's say, the time of the Spanish Armada, I would say I believe it's the San Felipe, the flagship of Recalde, the second in command of the Armada, because he and his crew really pretty much were a linchpin of the Armada. They consistently fought well. They consistently fought against odds that should have worn them down. And there are a number of key points during the Armada's advance up the channel where if Recalde and his ship had either gone down, been crippled, which in theory they should have been, or had just decided, we're taking far too much fire, we're going to fall back, that could potentially have caused a disintegration of the Armada's formation. But he held it together. Now, to a certain extent, the San Martin with Medina Sidonia aboard did a similar role, but I think Recalde probably takes the biscuit a little bit more so. Tradesman's Entrance asks, a lot has been said about Royal Navy aircraft carriers being able to essentially shrug off kamikaze strikes compared to US carriers that were hit. How do you think the various Axis fleet carriers would have handled those hits if they had swapped places with the Allied carriers? Generally speaking, not well. The Graf Zeppelin would have handled things very badly, considering that she had a minimal amount of metal on her flight deck that wasn't just deck plating, which would mean that kamikazes would be most likely to get through and would be nice and neatly broken up and just expanding into a massive, fireball of burning aviation fuel and whatever bombs they were carrying heading on downwards, which would do some really bad things to her hangar deck. Aquila and Spaviero, it's a bit harder to tell because sources conflict slightly on their overall armor layout. But Aquila, at least, while she was very, very likely to take horrific damage from kamikazes in her hangar, she does at least appear to have had a relatively decent amount of armor put over her magazines and gasoline tanks, so she might be marginally less likely to explode in a spectacular fireball. When it comes to the Japanese aircraft carriers, most of them, again, don't have a particularly well-protected flight deck. So, well, you see what happened to the Japanese when explosives were introduced to their hangars at Midway and so forth. If they were hit by kamikazes, that's pretty much what's going to happen. We'll just look at what happened to Franklin and Bunker Hill. Essentially that, but with less good damage control. Not good at all. The one that might have come through relatively well from kamikaze attacks, of course, would be Taiho, because she is an armoured flight deck carrier, so much of the resistive power that the British carriers enjoyed against kamikazes would have been exhibited similarly by Taiho. And then finally, for this week, and indeed this year, Herr Fuschfangsager asks, what on earth was Mitchell talking about with his Native American weather control machine? Was he talking about anything even remotely connected to reality, or did he just make stuff up? Or did he fall for the oldie-timey version of a water-fueled car? Could you get away with just putting unsupported claims like that into military proposals, or did he face any kind of fallout for it? I get the impression it was partly that Mitchell made up so much utter nonsense that he could say one thing, and by the time people realised what ridiculousness it was and decided to call him on it, he'd moved on to making 6 other claims, which had probably, edged out that first claim in your mind, and you're now more concerned about whatever he was talking about more proximately. Then I think there's also a degree of, he was probably, if I was going to be charitable, applying a similar thought process to those kind of claims as he was to some of the way he ran the section of the Air Force that he had. So, as mentioned in the video, he'd make all these bold and impressive claims about what bombs he had and what aircraft he had and how many there were and what they could do. And then the reality was that the Air Force was either only just experimenting with or was thinking about maybe commissioning someone to actually look into making an aircraft of that capability. And he kind of relied, I think, at that point on, if people question me about it, by the time they question me about it and I stall them and I put them off and then I can come back and answer them a little bit later, by that point, I can then point to something. So he could say, we're planning an aircraft that can take 6,000-pound bombs out to 150 miles. Such an aircraft doesn't actually exist, but a year later, an aircraft that maybe has 90% of that capability is at least on the drawing board. So by the time people have sort of recovered from the tidal wave of nonsense and written to him or called him back to say, about that bomber you mentioned, he goes, no, look, here it is. It's in the prototype stage, but it does exist. So again, if I was being charitable, maybe he saw something in one of the popular science magazines that said probably something along the lines of, scientists have begun to determine how some of the weather systems might be influenced, and he's gone and extrapolated from that and gone, clearly we can make a weather machine. If we understand how the weather is influenced, we can make a machine that will influence the weather, and thus we can control the weather. So when he spoke about Native American weather control devices, he wasn't talking about it the way we would understand it today, as in Native Americans, as in like the Cheyenne or the Sioux or the Iroquois or the Apache. He was talking in his mind about, generic citizens of the United States of America, as opposed to Europeans or Africans or South Americans or whoever. In terms of fallout, for that particular claim, I'm not necessarily sure he faced all that much censure, but his more grandiose claims did start to get less and less believed, and he was censured several times for some of the more provable, more military-related outlandish nonsense that he talked about. Although, sadly, the idea of putting unsupported claims that rest largely on fantasy into military proposals did not go away with Mitchell, and nor, to be fair, did it start with him. And with that, we bring Drax's video production efforts of 2024 to an end. Thank you very much for listening, everyone, if indeed you still are. And, well, I'll see you again in 2025 with any luck. Toodles for now.